And my mom's sitting there. And the nurse said, "Do you want me to do the injection or do you want to do it?" And, my mom kind of let me make the call. And the nurse said to me while I was thinking, "You're going to have to do this forever. So you might as well get started." And she handed both to me. And it was sort of like I don't want to say tough love, but it was like, "Here, this is going to be your thing." And that her handing me that was so powerful in that moment because it was like, okay, this is a terrible situation. I don't even know what to make of it yet. But she could see what I was going to need.
Welcome to the Protecting Your Nuts podcast. All people diagnosed with type 1 diabetes and even some with type 2 diabetes are required to take insulin on a daily basis. And although this necessary medicine is a lifeline for those living with diabetes, the emotional and physical toll it can take on individuals can't be overlooked. For those of you who have not experienced this, like my wife Karan, who has type 1 diabetes, imagine waking up every day knowing that you have to inject yourself with insulin multiple times just to stay alive. Here's what that looks like: the constant monitoring of blood sugar levels, the fear of hypoglycemia or hyperglycemia, the fear of the many potential long-term complications of diabetes, and of course, the financial strain of affording insulin itself. Today, I have a patient of mine who is living with type 1 diabetes, and my hope is that he'll provide some insights to you or someone you love who may be struggling so that a new path with less struggle can be found. Today's guest is Michael Papahronis. Mike has had type 1 diabetes for 27 years and has done the great work of being a middle school teacher for over 20 years. He's been married to his lovely wife for 17 years and is the proud father of two great kids. And he once shared with me that it's been a low-carb and keto diet that has saved his life. And I believe that's true because I've seen the magic of keto and low carb. And that's why I'm so happy to have you, Mike, on the Protecting Your Nuts podcast. Welcome, my friend.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Hampton. Yeah, no, all of what you said is true. It's been one of those things that, I didn't discover it until probably year 23, 24 of my diabetes journey, and super grateful for it. But also looking back, it's like, why didn't I know about this? So, and again, I think that's probably the frustration that lots of people, from all walks of life that have discovered low carb or keto or ketovore, whatever, have found that to be true. So yeah, I think it's no different. But
It's
it's been
it's it's
wonderful.
been amazing. Yeah, it's kind of done the same for my wife, and we tried plant-based for a while, but that didn't work for her blood sugars. And once we kind of went down this low-carb rabbit hole, it's been much better. And what I love about our conversation is that it's coming from a patient, and I've recently started to put some, very short patient testimonials uh, on the YouTube channel, and I just think it's important that people see people who are going through what they're going through, and those people provide hope. Even the greats like Westman, it was a patient testimonial that started his research in low carb, in 2002, following the mantle of Dr. Atkins, and we're so grateful for him for the work he's doing as well. So I really look forward to this conversation, and for those of you who may have somebody in your life who's dealing with diabetes in general, dealing with type 1 diabetes in particular, or just a type 2 with insulin dependent, this conversation will at least provide some hope of what's possible. So let's start our conversation a little bit around who are you? Where'd you grow up? And do you think anything about your childhood really that you can think of that really shaped who you became?
So I'm 42. I grew up just outside of Chicago in a suburb called Park Ridge back in the 80s and 90s. My mom was a stay-at-home mom. My dad he's still with us, but he's no longer, he's retired. We're Greek, so there's like a state law that says we have to own a restaurant here in Illinois. So, I grew up working in a diner on the northwest side of the city. He just retired. He's 80. He just retired about 4 years ago. 24-hour diner, the whole bit. My mom's not Greek. My mom grew up out in the west suburbs in Hillside. And And so it was an interesting mix growing up where, my dad was literally a war refugee from World War II. He was born um, in June of 1944 in the woods because the village was on fire when his mom went into labor. So there's that crazy, something that I have no reference for. And then my mom had this really idyllic upbringing in the 50s in the Chicago suburbs. And so that mix always made things really interesting. But I credit both of them with constantly just being very, very, very grounded, real people um, who just always wanted to do what was best for my brother and I. But from a type 1 standpoint, I was diagnosed when I was about 14, 15 years old. I think a lot of, particularly with my mom, um, she was my biggest advocate. And, something that was such a shock for me now as a parent, I can't even imagine what they were going through, but
Mm.
trying not to, you know, telegraph that to me because they knew I was struggling on my own with a lot of these new things. But really, I mean, they're really great, and they are. I mean, but the reason I've been able to be successful and keep looking for those next ways of constantly evolving and getting better with my self care is because of them, particularly my mom. I mean, the stuff she went through in the early '90s when insurance wouldn't cover things, and
Mm.
she was the reason that I was able to be successful. So for
Wow.
sure.
That's amazing. Well, shout out to all the people born in the woods. Let me just
And
say that.
well, it's
I
funny.
mean,
Like he would joke with my brother and I when we were kids. I would be like, "Oh, I remember once I was complaining. Oh, we only have apple juice, no orange juice." And he just looked at me and he was like, "You know, people say, 'What were you born in a barn? You left the door open.'" He's like, "Oh, the barn would have been a step up for me." He's like,
right. It's
So
crazy.
but he jokes about it. And he doesn't remember, but definitely, just that whole generation, some crazy stuff. So yeah, his immigration story was interesting, and how he met my mom and all that. But I just think it made what I like to think is for some well-roundedness in my brother.
Yeah. I mean, you're gonna be grounded when you start out life that way, and you're gonna be grounded when you think parents have gone through just to get you to where you are. What grounds us is the support. You had a lot of support, right? Like, I mean,
I never wanted for any sort of emotional support or anything.
yeah, and you can't live in a bubble of I get this diagnosis, particularly as a child, and you don't have support. It's a team, it's all hands on deck.
Yep.
And once you learn the value of low carb and how important that is, and to really apply those principles, it really needs the whole family's got to be involved. Otherwise,
Yep.
you're gonna feel like you're not really being supported. But I love also the Greek background,
Yep.
and we know our heritage huge role. So there are things about our background that create challenges. You've just given us some of the things about your background that may have made you stronger. So when you think about your background from a Greek perspective, have you seen related to how you're needing to live right now?
Totally. I 100%, it impacts it. I eat my stress. I know this about myself. I didn't realize it until I was probably in my 30s. But I don't know if it's a cultural thing. I have lots of extended family that have said the same thing. We eat, when we're upset, we eat. When we're all you have to do is just look at the way that maybe, the culture or the religion treats things. If you go to a Greek Orthodox wedding, there's food falling on you from everywhere. If you go to a Greek
Right.
Orthodox funeral, there's food everywhere, and I think that's the case with most ethnic backgrounds. Whether it's Greek or anything else. But yeah, so there's always food around. And and for me, again, going back to my dad, they grew up, they were farmers, so they had food. Like they were subsistence
Mm,
farmers, so they had food. He always said, he's like, we weren't starving. It wasn't great, but we weren't starving. But I think if you add in that kind of farming culture, even though it wasn't here in the United States, um, I think using food, the importance of food is at the center of life when you're in agriculture. And when that transferred to the United States, they weren't farming anymore. They were working in the steel mills in Gary
mhm,
and things like that before they got into restaurants. But using food to celebrate because things were rough, and then they came here and things got a whole lot better. It wasn't like, "Oh, you better finish what's on your plate because we didn't have food," because that was actually never the case for them. It's
mhm.
more, hey, we're so happy that we're all together and successful and safe. Let's eat. And so there's the stress part of it, but then there's also the celebration part of it. And one of my favorite things in the world to do is at different holidays to go over to my dad's sister's house. Shout out to my Aunt Georgia, who
That's right.
she's people ask me, oh, where do I go to get good Greek desserts and things like that? The answer is I don't know, because my Aunt Georgia has always made those things, and
Right.
I've never had to find a deli or a bakery. So,
That's
um,
right.
but it definitely plays into my role with food, especially after the type 1 diagnosis. When you're diagnosed, traditionally, they'll say, okay, make a list of everything you eat in a day. And you do that. And then they titrate the insulin to that level of carbohydrate. And in my case, it was a lot. And then if you throw in my mom's kind of Irish Catholic uh, side, they're not afraid of starch. They're not afraid of sugar. They're
Right.
not afraid of potatoes. They're not afraid. And so casseroles, especially given the generational, she grew up in the 50s and 60s, and that way of eating. But all of that kind of ethnic blend that was in my house definitely, made me reconsider how I think about food as an adult. Because especially once I started keto, you know, I don't see keto as an elimination diet. I really don't. I
Mm-mm.
don't. I am more satisfied with what I eat now than ever before. But at the same time, there are times that food just needs to be a way to get to the next step. Like, oh, I need to eat something. I'm going to eat. I'm going to move on. And separating that emotion from it is important for me, particularly just because of my relationship with food as a kid. Um, but I think my ethnic background probably made that a little bit more of a challenge. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
just because it's hard to pass on some of that stuff when everybody's around and it's Easter, and but the good news is, there's a lot of lamb, there's a lot of eggs, there's things like that. So
Yes.
finding keto options, it's just, you just got to be creative, and I
Yeah.
find that I end up looking forward to doing that
Yeah, and I think it's again, I spoke several years ago to some business people about low carb and keto, and I we traveled to Santorini, Greece,
Mm,
and I found it very easy. I mean, of
yep,
course, there's grains and things that you have to,
yep,
man, but it was arguably one of my favorite kind of like cultural things to work with around keto because the food is off the chain. I really enjoyed that, and I think about uh, Aunt Georgia. Shout out to Aunt Georgia again,
yeah,
because I had an aunt Hazel who's now deceased. She did make it into her mid 80s, and she worked at Entenmann's, where we get, for those who are not familiar, at least in the United States, they make a lot of bakery goods that you'll see in the grocery store, and very not exactly keto exactly, but I'm gonna tell you, man, and when she made stuff, I don't know if they trained them at the bakery, but when she made stuff at home, man, it was like to die for. So she was very good with that, and I do miss her. And you just have these people in your life who are really trying to, give you love through food. And now what we're trying to do is take it even up a notch and say we're gonna still give you something that tastes great, but it's not gonna cause harm. Our aunts didn't know this
oh
back
man.
then, so you know.
But the sweetest thing is, now she's probably, my dad's 80, she's probably 75 or so.
Mm,
25, 27 years ago when I was diagnosed, she started making all the cookies at Easter with Splenda and this and that, just to be,
there
when
you
I was
go.
in the 90s, we were eating artificial sweeteners. It was no problem.
That's right.
And she still, to this day, she will call. I don't eat tree nuts because of migraine stuff. It has nothing to do with diabetes. And she will send a package home and say, those cookies that I know you like, I made them without nuts. And she knows,
Whew.
uh, as Vinnie Tortorich tells us, you got to put life into living sometimes. And so
Right.
I'll have one of those at Easter time. And God bless her, she makes them without nuts. She's the, she and my dad are I'm very lucky, by both my parents, but my extended family too, just some of the warmest people in the world,
Yeah, yeah, and I felt warm just hearing you describe them, so I'm glad we brought them to this conversation.
for sure.
Now, let's go to that, like, diagnosis, man,
Mhm.
'cause, I remember when my wife was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, and
Yeah.
it was, man, so
So was
and
she a kid when that happened, or was this later in life, or?
this was later in life too, probably, uh she was, we're now 56, so probably, a little bit over, it's been over 10 years for sure.
Oh, okay.
Maybe because I'm thinking about, yeah, it's probably been around 12 years or so.
Mhm.
And I tell you, man, devastating moment. And even as a doctor who I'm supposed to be the expert of all of this stuff, I was ill equipped to provide a path. Now, even when I learned about low carb, I so much of it was focused on type 2. So, what do you do with somebody with type 1? Is it different? So I had to do a lot of education. And I'm just curious, like, you're a teacher, which, I feel like we're teaching right now, right? By just being together today. And to be successful, you have to have a certain amount of knowledge. You have to have the certain amount of emotional strength. So, what did you know about diabetes the day before you were diagnosed? Like, what was your basic knowledge?
So, absolutely nothing. My basic knowledge was, I mean, same as everybody else you hear in health class when I was a sophomore in high school when I was diagnosed. So,
Mhm.
um, it was winter break and I woke up and my vision was blurry. And I'm going,
Mhm.
that's weird. And I tell my mom, and my mom said, okay, we'll get you in. We went to the eye doctor, and it was my eye doctor. Actually, this was with Advocate
Mm.
out in the
Oh,
mid 90s, a guy named Dr. Katz, who I believe his son or his nephew is still practicing up
okay.
in Niles. He said, I could easily give you glasses. He said, but something doesn't seem right here. Can you do me a favor? Go get a fasting blood sugar. He's like, I
Mm.
just got a hunch. Now, everyone in my family wears glasses. He could have easily just said, yep, here's your prescription.
That's right.
But the dude was a caring doctor, and he did his due diligence. And I went, and I remember did the blood sugar test, the fasting blood sugar test, and I was 421. And the doctor said, "Wow, yeah, you're diabetic. You could." I had been playing high school football that year, and I think a lot
Mhm.
of that exercise helped keep it
Yeah.
from being 800. But by the time winter had run, that kind of wore off. I guess I don't know. But diagnosed, and I just remember sitting there, and I don't know what this means. I know there were a couple of people in my elementary school. Um, that had been diagnosed. And I didn't go to
Mhm.
a very big elementary school. So, the neighborhood where I grew up, it seemed to be, which was an interesting thing in and of itself. But I knew a couple of kids. It wasn't, and I just, oh, okay, that means you can't eat sugar. What does that mean? And
Mhm.
that's kind of the average definition I think that most people have
That's
for
right.
for
That's
type
right.
one and even type two.
Right.
They don't totally know, or they're
Mhm.
used to seeing all the ads on TV and they think that that's what diabetes is for everybody. And I
That's
didn't
right.
understand that it's autoimmune, and I didn't
Mhm.
understand that there are, compounding that, they started asking questions about family history, things like that. It's not anywhere in my family, for certain
Mhm.
on my mom's side. On my dad's side, we just don't know because at that time and where he grew up, they didn't have medical care. So, um, you know, if somebody got sick or passed away, it was just like, okay, well, I'm not sure what that was. So we don't know if it was on his side of the family. I don't think it was.
Mhm.
So, it could just be something that came up out of nowhere. But I was in shock, to be honest with you. I was sitting, it was at Lutheran General Hospital, and I was sitting just in shock. And again, within, a day, they said, okay, go home, get some things. We're going to check you into the hospital for a few days so that we can get you squared away and get you
That's
moving, get
right.
you in the right direction. And God bless my mom. She okay, this is what we're doing and we're going to move forward. And she was an advocate for me. She was there every step of the way. My dad was working a lot. He was always there too, but he was just working a lot. Um, and so it was shock, but also I felt really, really well taken care of.
Right.
My endocrinologist at the time, I had him for a couple of years, and then he ended up, I believe, going to Peoria to be the head of endocrinology for a hospital out there. So he was wonderful. Um, and yeah, that adjustment was definitely a process, and full of trial and error. And on top of that, this is the 90s, right? So
Mhm.
um, low fat is the craze. Sugar doesn't bother you as long as So the dietary landscape at that time was definitely something that was made it challenging. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's definitely something that was an interesting situation. I will say one of the when we talk about these people that just share little moments with you, there
Mhm.
was a nurse that came in to the room, and I hadn't taken any insulin yet, and she hands me a bottle of NPH and she hands me a syringe and she says, this is insulin. We're going to start taking your basal dose and all that. Okay. And my mom's sitting there, and the nurse said, do you want me to do the injection or do you want to do it? And, my mom kind of let me make the call. And the nurse said to me while I was thinking, you're going to have to do this forever. So you might as well get started. And she handed both to me. And it was sort of like I don't want to say tough love, but it was like, here, this is going to be your thing. And that her handing me that was so powerful in that moment, because it was like, okay, this is a terrible situation. I don't even know what to make of it yet. But she could see what I was going to need.
Yeah.
And that if I take control of this, that I can own it at least a little bit, even in this time of chaos. And so that was somebody who, she probably didn't think about it. She went on to the next patient, but
That's right.
it was something that was really, really impactful. Just one of those little moments that shared that power with me.
And I think a well-trained nurse who has a little experience on top of that, the icing on the cake, maybe it's keto icing. Uh, she has the experience to know that if I empower this young man in this moment, that then may continue to allow him to be empowered in a way that's necessary. Because again, we
Yep.
need that family support, but we really need the person with it to be. So when you're off to college, and you're trying to live in an environment where you're just forced to, be tempted, you'll be able to make better decisions. So I'm really happy that she empowered you in that moment.
Yep.
And, when you think back on that time, like even I'm sure reflecting on it now, it elicits emotions, right? So, uh, how do you feel your emotions were impacted as a young man having to? Because if you know what it really is, it probably elevates the emotions even more. And sometimes we really don't fully understand what this means. You're going to have to do this for the rest of your life. So, what
Yep.
emotions come to mind?
And that's it. I mean, at 15, I remember and this part was probably, as a parent now, this was probably heartbreaking for my mom, where at a
Oh
certain
yeah,
point in the first couple of weeks, but she was stonewall about it. But that was great, which was helpful. But within the first couple of weeks, I remember saying to my mom, well, if I'm taking insulin all the time, how will I know if it goes away?
yeah,
And she was, and she said, oh, sweetheart, we don't totally need to worry about that. But telling your kid, like, no, you have this thing that's never going to go away. That,
right,
the fact that she was able to keep a dry eye during them, I'll tell you right now, with my two kids, I would be a wreck and I am
right,
diabetic. So,
yeah,
um, but I think the biggest thing at the beginning was I didn't grieve enough. You have to hit the ground running and you've got to get going. And, if you don't start
right,
taking insulin, you're literally going to die. So,
right.
I don't think I gave it time to breathe in terms of the grieving process and going through those stages of loss of
Hmm.
this way of living, and now there's going to be this new way of living.
Yeah,
And that's one of the things as it pertains to low carb that I'm a teacher. I see kids. It was a crazy coincidence. 2 years ago, the first year, sort of normal back to school after COVID, I had 2 or 3 kids just in my homeroom that all just by coincidence happened to be newly diagnosed type 1s.
right.
And I saw them going through the exact same emotions and the exact same experiences that I did in the 90s, with multiple daily injections. And the doctors were saying, we're going to wait about 6 months to get you on a pump. Um, and then struggling with the traditional American diet, just being titrated to with insulin, right? And I'm watching them struggle, and I'm a teacher. I'm not a doctor. I'm
Hmm.
not going to step in and say, hey, there's this way of eating. Um, but it's watching them go through it from the other side of it for me was something that was very powerful, because I was all of a sudden, boom, I was right back there. I was 15 again, and I'm watching these guys do that. But for myself, yeah, it was. I don't think I gave it enough time to be able to be sad about it, because it's
Right,
like,
right,
okay, well, I'm 15, and then the social part. I don't want to go to school and be different than all the kids. I don't want
right.
to have to
That's
bring my
it.
own desserts to birthday parties. I don't
That's
have
it.
to. And so you're focused, especially at 15, more on that social piece
Yeah,
of it, I
yeah.
think. Um, I used to wear the diabetes necklace with the medical alert. I wear a
Hmm.
bracelet now, but I
Right.
used to wear a necklace. My mom would drop me off at high school, and I would walk in the building, and as soon as I knew I was out of sight line, I would take the
That's
thing
right.
off. I would put it away because I didn't want to be different. And it's for me now on the other side of it as a teacher, whether it's diabetes or other medical issues or whatever, making it front and center that this is fine. This is not your fault. This is a diversity thing where we have people coming from all different abilities, medical background. That to me has been really powerful to share in front of,
Right.
hitting on that with students. And I think in 2024, we're doing a really good job compared to the 90s with including others and differences and all that stuff. But it's still hard. It's still really, really hard to feel different.
Yeah.
I can remember even into my 20s and late 20s and early 30s when my wife and I were first together, I would go low. My blood sugar would drop low, and we would be at a restaurant, and I wouldn't want to bother the waitress for something with
Mm.
sugar in it. And my wife is
Mhm.
going. And my wife grew up around a lot of diabetics, so she's been my biggest support network, bar none. And she'll call the waitress over and go, I'm really sad. Mike here, do you have orange juice? And the waitress, every human I've ever asked says, oh my gosh, of course they want to help. People want to help. No
That's
matter
right.
where you go, by and
That's
large,
right.
people are good and they want to help. And
That's
so
right.
getting over that emotional hurdle to be able to ask for the help, I certainly think that was something that as an adult out on my own, I had to learn.
Yeah.
But yeah, originally it was shocking. And you know, I'm glad. I mean, I'm so grateful for where I am now.
That's
And
right.
low carb is the biggest after insulin itself. Low
That's
carb
right.
is the most important part of my therapy.
That's right.
Um, and so, yeah, those are things that are just, I think those are probably the things that I was feeling most when all
Yeah.
of that was going on.
I think and I think not only do people wanna help us, I remember when I walked, onto a Disney cruise, and we've
Mhm,
done many of those, and it's like it's dramatic, and they announce your name and, all this craziness, but then when I walked on a low-carb cruise, it wasn't the same. It wasn't a Disney cruise, right? And in this moment, I think I'm so used to Disney that I think people are always watching me, and they know. I mean, before you get to the cabin, they know some stranger says, "Hey, hi, Dr. Hampton, Miss
wow.
Cron," and then they name the kids. I'm like, "What the?"
Yeah,
So, but the thing is, that's not the Disney's. That's not the real world. The real world, people are not paying attention to you like that. You're paying attention. You're
totally.
having your internal moment, and you
Uh-huh.
think everybody around you is noticing. They're not
And
noticing. And then, so not only they're not noticing, which should make you feel more comfortable, but when you need help, they're there to help. So I just
yeah.
think that story is amazing. I think that our I also think about what you said about, like, there's so many things to kinda know and understand. It was kind of a blessing that you were younger, that you didn't really dive into it
Yes.
deeper,
Yep.
but Imma tell you, man, I think about all those little things, like you're saying, "Okay, I have to walk into the school, I'm a teenager, and I'm embarrassed." So, man, if we could do a better job, and I know we refer people to nutrition, and we love our nutrition professionals, but man, if we had like kind of a playbook, these are the things that you need to think about as a teenager. We have a lot of work to do so that when people are diagnosed with these conditions, they kind of know what to expect and don't worry about this. And yeah, I know, here's a support group like Type One Grit or
Mhm,
whatever, just to make sure. And the last thing I'll say is, yeah, I think my wife being diagnosed older,
mhm,
um, I kinda have more of a late onset type 1
mhm.
diabetes. I think that was helpful because, and it was helpful in terms of what she needs to know, but it was more painful. She knew
Yeah.
too much. She's a pharmacist, so she's like,
Oh, wow.
"Oh my god."
Yeah.
I
So
mean,
she
I'm
when they
giving
told her, she knew exactly what was going on.
she
She
knew what
yes.
was about to happen. When she
And
heard type
that's
1, that was
yep.
the end of it for her. So she lost her mind for a while,
Yeah.
and we're in a much better place now because we know what to do.
Yep.
But I think that's totally, understandable in terms of
Totally.
what you
And
experienced.
I feel lucky, and I'm sure you guys feel the same way. I mean, you guys are both medical professionals, and I'm, just I've always, been someone, I was lucky I had access to education growing up, things like that. And I think it also just speaks to the idea of if we're going to get people healthier,
Mhm.
you know, imagine trying to do this in a situation where your resources are limited or where
Right.
where your access to care is limited, whether
Man,
that be
please.
because of socioeconomic level, geographic. I just spent about 4 days in rural Michigan, and
Mm.
it makes you realize it was beautiful up there, but it makes you realize how lucky we are to have the medical care system we have here in Chicago. And I feel for the people who are trying to deal with some of this, but I think that's why why podcasts like yours, like Vinny Tordorich's, like Dr. Sean Baker, all of,
That's right.
Westman, all of these low carb folks are so important, because that can break down some of those barriers, right? And if you're
That's
sitting in the
right.
middle of, Nebraska, and you don't have access to, maybe, I could Google and find, which we'll go into. It's a funny story about how I ended up finding you, versus the traditional practitioner who maybe isn't familiar with low carb. Um, I had options. It wasn't huge, obviously, but I had something that I could go to. But if you don't have that, I think some of this information sharing is even more important, because
That's right.
otherwise it's just not there.
Yeah, I love
And
that,
as
and
type ones, we don't have a choice. Like type two, I know
yeah.
it's a therapeutic. I had basically heard about low carb through type two, in my own journey approaching type two.
Mhm.
But there's a whole community of us type ones here that are sitting here going, we never knew about this, and this is a
That's right.
tool that, I know Dr. Bernstein has been talking about that, obviously, literally his entire life.
That's
Um,
right.
but yeah, it's just it's important work that you guys are doing. So,
Yeah.
and it's, we can share, we as diabetics can share experiential evidence all the time,
Mhm.
but we don't have that MD after our name, right? We
Right.
didn't go to school for that. We didn't. So when we have people that are experts like yourself, it gives a lot of it gives legs to the movement of, I'm never going to get off insulin. I know that, and I'm okay with that.
Right, right.
And I
Yeah.
always say, between the technology of the CGMs and the pumps, and between, obviously we have insulin. 150 years ago, I would be in much different situation.
Right.
Um, but adding in that low carb diet piece felt like a giant cornerstone of, if diabetes doesn't affect me every moment of every day, and I can basically go on about life, and then it's just something that I have to manage through technology and diet, well, then it's much more of just a nuisance, rather
Mhm.
than but it's a tolerable nuisance, rather than something that's as devastating as it was when I was first diagnosed, or when your wife was first diagnosed, and things like that. So
That's right. Yeah, I think the knowledge will make it tolerable. The knowledge will allow you to see, oh, I can live a full life, and I can be like Dr. Who's probably in his low 90s now.
he
He's
is.
that
Yep.
guy's
Yep.
he's doing his thing. So
Yep.
so listen, let's go into this idea of how you discovered this. Now,
Sure.
again, I mentioned a moment ago that it'd be nice if we were giving people kind of a playbook, and part of the playbook would say, um, if you have type 1 diabetes or type 2, um, there's some things in your diet that you should do. And it shouldn't be like a casual referral to nutrition who's
Right.
potentially going to say you need a balanced diet. It needs to be very clear that um, this ideal of reducing the thing that causes your sugar to spike is probably a good idea now, or you're going to be chasing it. You're going to be chasing these spikes for the rest of your life. So for you, how did you, because you said this is 27 years for you now,
Yep.
but yet
Yep.
it sounds like it was only like 4 years ago. So
It
how did
was. It
so
was. I can tell
somebody
you, it
didn't
was
tell you this stuff. So how did
right.
you figure it out?
Well, and that's, I think you and I talked about it last time I saw you, where it's like the Twilight Zone. You discover this, and you go, you feel. I know this isn't the case, but you feel like the world has been keeping this big secret from you. Where you go, oh
Right.
my God, where has this been all my life?
That's
And
right.
then I feel like, and this is where, now that I know it, and I've had so much success with it, um, I just want to tell, especially people who are struggling with various medical conditions, I want to tell them all about it. Now, I make it a point to never proselytize about it, because my official stance is everybody should eat the way that works for them, right? Um, but if people ask me about it, I'm happy to talk your ear off about it. So, and I think too, that goes in, just touches back on the part where I was embarrassed to even mention that I was diabetic. Now it's an opposite, especially after seeing kids at school struggle with it. I take the opposite approach, which is, I wish there were advocates that were talking all about it, and saying, here, about diabetes in general, and make it not it's a personal medical thing. No, 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 no. Let's talk about it. The health teacher where I work approaches me sometimes and says, some of the kids are talking about that you're diabetic in my class. Is that okay? I go, yeah, good.
Mm.
Yes, absolutely. I'll
Yes.
come in.
Yes.
I'll do whatever you want. I'm not going to proselytize about diet,
That's
especially
right.
because I'm not a doctor. But hey, this is something on the forefront. This is how to just understand it better. And if we can
Mhm.
understand it better, it's, it's like anything. We're gonna do better with it. But in terms of my discovery of low carb, it was probably 8-10 years ago. Um, my kids were young, and stress and
Mhm.
jobs, and you're in your early 30s, and you're trying to buy houses or a house, and you're trying to whatever, or you're trying to make a life for this family, right? And I'm a stress eater, and I kept seeing my nutritionists, and they would say, okay, well, your cholesterol is going up a little bit. I was eating a traditional American diet, along
Mhm.
with, they said, oh, diabetics can eat whatever they want as long as you take enough insulin for it, which
That's right.
I find to be patently false in my life
Yes.
as it applies to me.
Yeah.
But again, hey, oh, everybody's going to McDonald's. Sure, I can do that. And the weight every year from like probably 25, 26 years old up until about 38, my weight ticked up and ticked up and ticked
Mhm.
up. My cholesterol kept going up. Um, uh, and just all of those hallmarks of things are not going well. And I
That's
didn't
right.
I didn't know what metabolic disease was, and I didn't know what the path to I didn't even know it was a thing, right?
That's
In my
right.
head, I'm going, oh well, I'm type 1 diabetic. Okay, I've been dealt that card. I can't be dealt anything else like type 2 or anything like that, when that's not true, right? I became incredibly insulin resistant. But anyway, I found Vinny Tortorich, and his, I think at the time it was called the Angriest Trainer podcast. And now, he's a little bit different with that, but it's a huge resource for me. And his partner, Anna Vocino, I have her cookbooks up in my cabinet that I live by. But Vinny had this really, I heard him on a different podcast, and he had this really accessible PDF where here's what it is, here are different names for sugar, here's
Mhm.
why it works. And he explained, no one ever explained to me what insulin actually does. Doctors never did. And so that's another one of those things that's frustrating, right? Um, but I also understand, because we're just trying to live this life. We're trying to make
Mhm.
sure our numbers are in control. We don't maybe have time at 15, 16, 17 to understand what hormones do in your body, right? So, and I tried it here and there, but I didn't really try it with much integrity in terms of sticking with it. I was busy, and I grew up hearing, how are you going to look at a cheeseburger and say it's the bun that's making you
Mhm.
fat or making you
Mhm.
unhealthy? Um, and then, so that went on for a few years, and I would lose a little weight because I would stick with it. And then
Mhm.
what I didn't see there is it was working. I just had to stick with it. It was working, and getting past that 2-week, 3-week
That's
window at the
right.
beginning where you're still addicted to those carbs. Once you get past that, it gets a lot easier. I didn't know that. So fast forward to fall of 2020, we're mid-pandemic. I'm teaching from home. My employer set up my school district had an online academy for the kids who have medical issues that couldn't be around,
Mhm.
immunocompromised, things like that. And they said, hey, Mike, why don't you teach on this? So I was teaching on Zoom for a year. Um, so I was at home, and I had access to my kitchen all day. So I was
Mhm.
able to make those meals and able to,
Right.
but I was 240 pounds. I'm 6'2". I was 240 pounds at the time.
Mhm.
And I went in for my annual endocrinologist appointment, and I said, Doc, I don't know what to say. My insulin's just not working anymore. I'm taking more
Mhm.
and more and more. And I didn't
Mhm.
know what insulin resistance was, except I knew there was this guy, Vinny, talking about it a little bit,
Mhm.
in this podcast that I've heard. But I thought that was mostly for type 2. And my doctor said, I said, what's going on? And she said, well, your metabolism. And she was dancing around it a little, I think, to save my feelings. And about
Mhm.
halfway through the conversation, she's a wonderful doctor. About halfway through the conversation, I kind of got what she was picking up. And I
Right.
maybe shouldn't have said it so bluntly, but I said, whoa, 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 whoa. Am I too fat? And she said, well, we would like to put it a little more. And I said, you're right. Is it my metabolism that's the problem right now? And she said, thank you for making this easy. Yes, you're eating too many carbohydrates. And I said,
Mhm.
oh, and that to me was this, she was presenting it as if it was this bad news. For me, it was like,
Mhm.
oh, well, no, that's something we can fix.
Right, that's right.
So she mentioned, basically I was approaching type 2. Like
Mhm.
it was my metabolism. And so she started telling me what the options were for type 2 meds. But I had Vinny's voice in my ear go, I hear him talking about people
That's
with type
right.
2 getting off of meds because of the way that they've changed their way of eating. And I went, you know what? I'm just going to investigate this for a few weeks. I'm going to try. December, I can tell you, I mean, this is every one of us who's ever done this we remember the date, right? December 18th,
That's
2020.
right. That's right.
Uh, I just said, you know what? I'm just going to go all in. I can't keep going like this. I'm just going to go all in. That was December 18th of 2020. And at the beginning, I just cut out sugars and grains. He does his NSNG. So I just followed that, ate vegetables that grow above the ground, cut out sugars, cut out grains, cut out processed foods, seed oils, and was trained myself to not be afraid of butter and olive oil. What was funny is that training in our brain is so hard to break, because every time I would opt for dark meat or put butter on something instead of like white meat chicken, I would like wait for a bolt of lightning to hit me, because you know what I mean? It's something that we're so, fat's bad, fat's bad. So, the next 3 months, I would say between 90 and 120 days. So 3 to 4 months, I lost 60 pounds. And it just fell off to where my wife was joking, and she's like, I feel weird. This is like having a different person lying in bed next to me. Like
That's right.
It just fell off. And I think part of that is a testimonial also to what I was eating before. I mean, if it fell off that quickly. But man, it was like, I thought this was just that old adage of, oh, you're just aging. That's why you feel this way. And it's like,
That's
well,
right.
no,
That's right.
I haven't felt the way I feel. I remember having this thought then, and I still feel I haven't felt this healthy since I was a teenager, in terms of just my metabolism, my body, what I'm able to do, in terms of exercise, things like that. And I went back to my endocrinologist, and to her credit, this was 4 years ago. And she said, whatever you're doing, keep doing it. She's like, I can't say that it's one or the other, but it makes sense that if you're limiting, and the craziest thing is I was using 10 to 20% of the insulin I was using before. I have screenshots I took from my phone with my CGM, where before it looked like a roller coaster.
That's right.
Flags. And then within 2 weeks of being on low carb, it is just a flat line. Do I still have those roller coaster days? Of course, we're humans. It's going to happen. But man, it was, and then it was just off and running. And then I started getting curious and looking, and I went from Vinny to I was like, well, okay, what doctors are doing this? And you had been a guest on his podcast, and I had heard you, Dr. Brett Scher was in my universe. Basically, all those guys that were in, and those men and women that were in Fat, a documentary. And then you start reading about these things, and you go, oh, there's a whole thing here. This isn't just me.
That's right.
And that's where it really took off. And now it's again, it's been the biggest change in my life, other than the invention of insulin back in the 1920s.
Right.
This is the biggest thing that has saved my life. And I said, at the top of the show, you said it saved his life. It did. It 100% saved my life. It maybe didn't save it today or tomorrow, but the trick with diabetes is that all of these complications are going to be, if you're lucky enough, in your 60s, 70s, 80s.
That's right.
That is not. That's a deal breaker for me in terms of.
Right.
I'm and so that long term, it's the ultimate delayed gratification. And if it's so hard in your 20s, 30s to see, well, I got to be careful for my 70s. Well, this diet makes that doable, and it makes it easier. And I don't worry about it anymore. I used to worry every time I went to my diabetic eye exam every year. When am I going to go blind? When am I going to start having? They're going to say, oh, we found some issues. Now I don't worry about it, because I walk in knowing knowledge is empowering. I know what my numbers were. I know what my A1C was. And I know that if I keep my A1C below a certain level, those are no longer concerns. Just like I don't worry about the negative effects of smoking, because I don't smoke.
That's right.
If you don't have those things coming into those inputs, you're going to be much healthier. And it's very, from an emotional standpoint, that's so important.
Wow, that's a great statement. That sounds like a T-shirt. If I, don't worry about smoking, because the negative effects of smoking, because I don't smoke, and the same is true for carbs. If I don't have those spikes, right? I mean, those spikes. My wife trying to chase those spikes, and the advice she was given, like you. Don't worry. Eat as many carbs as you want. Just match it with the insulin, but you can't match it with the insulin. There's too many variables that make it, and not only the variables related to how many carbs are you actually consuming that you're trying to match. Just, am I under stress today?
Man,
did I get enough sleep last night? Did I have a
dawn effect? Dawn effect is still something that I struggle with every morning, and it's fun. Yep.
So what you're trying to do is, let's control the factors we can. And we can live with the factors that we can't. But most of these factors you can improve. You can reduce your carbs. You can learn how to manage your stress. You can learn how to deal with, making sure you get enough sleep. All of these things can be managed.
Mhm.
And of course, you're going to gain weight if we keep pumping all this insulin. Insulin is the fat storage hormone. So if we don't need as much insulin because we're eating less carbs, then we're not likely to have to worry about someone with type 1 starting to look like they got type 2 and
That's it.
having, it's insane. So, and if you look it up, it'll probably say, no, you can't be, go from type 1 to type 2. But the reality is, yes, you can. If you keep pumping all that stuff in your body and you're not living a lifestyle that can support this diagnosis, you're going to struggle. So now I know that some of us are low carb, some of us are carnivore. And what's been your experience in terms of you're deciding where to land? We don't want to be too like rigid about these things. We just
Right.
want to do what works, right? So when you found yourself deciding where I can land, you said sometimes I got, going back to Aunt Georgia, right? So sometimes I got to do what she did, even though she's trying to work with it. How
Yep.
did you land where you landed in terms of keto, low carb, carnivore, ketovore? Where are you at?
So I think it's always in flux a little bit.
Hmm.
For me, as you said, I found keto to be, at least up until now, the one that's been the most useful and the most
Hmm.
kind of doable with my lifestyle. An interesting thing is, as you said, I'm a teacher, and during the school year, I'm always looking for, when you look forward to summer, right? It's like on summer, I'm
Hmm.
going to exercise, I'm going to be on a great eating regimen and all. And I'm finding now that I'm here because my diet has improved and my health has improved so much that I'm kind of fine tuning now. And I'm finding that summer is actually harder because I have this free time and I have access to the kitchen all day. And I have, when I'm more regimented in my work schedule, I teach all morning. So I don't eat breakfast. I don't eat until about 11 o'clock. Um, uh, but so it's easier for me to maintain that kind of keto. Uh, I don't just try to stick low carb, and I try to really just eliminate all of it as much as I can. But keto has worked for me up until now. I will say, I guess what I'm trying to say is that because things have gotten so good, or so much better, that it exposes the weak links in the chain then, right? When I was 240 pounds, anything was an improvement. And now it's like, oh, I'm noticing from 8 a.m. to 10 a.m., I'm having stress hormones that are raising my blood sugar. I never noticed that before because everything was a hot mess. So now it exposes those kind of weak links. Um, and I'm finding with my keto journey that there are some quote unquote keto sort of things I got away with, keto friendly foods that I got away with that I think I can't get away with anymore. Things like dairy. Uh, um, I'm finding that as I fine tune my diet, I'm relying more and more on dairy for proteins and fats, and I need to be eating more meat um, instead. And part of it is just because dairy's I love dairy.
Of
Like
course.
and you read about and correct me if I'm wrong, there are certain addictive properties to certain milk products or certain dairy
Hmm.
products. Is that
Yeah,
true? Yeah. So, and I
absolutely.
think I'm approaching that. So dairy fats seem to be fine, high fat dairy. So whipping cream and butter seem to be fine with me. But overuse, I think, is something that is becoming a problem for me. So that's where now, and especially I listened to the episode just this week with the carnivore rabbi that you had on. That
Absolutely.
I think carnivore is probably my next stop, and I think I can do moderation with dairy, with high fat dairy, but I think to start with, I want to go to carnivore next, just to
Yeah,
see what's the difference.
the
Here's with
experiment. Yeah.
just experiment, and if it's night and day, well, then I know that okay, I've keyed onto something here that's actually could be a problem.
I think the key word is experiment. And I think that many of us who have experimented to the extremes, and I
Hmm.
would, most people would consider carnivore an extreme, just like you said, we need to have people in front of us who maybe have done the experiment before us, and
Hmm.
then we can then do the experiment on ourselves. So even if we use Dr. Paul Saladino, he gave us the courage with the carnivore code book to, okay, we got this guy who's in the medical field who's looking great, doing a great job. And he did an experiment with carnivore and it worked out. Now he's doing a different kind of experiment now where he's adding the fruit back. But even with that model, there may be some people who can do that. Some people are as athletic as he is, and they can get away with that. Many of my patients probably can't. So
Yep.
I think the experimentation piece is really important so that people can see where they land. And nobody needs to be a carnivore or keto or low carb. You have to decide where you're gonna, do the best. But being willing to experiment is really valuable,
Mm-hmm.
because I think that if you don't experiment, you just won't know. And is it possible you need to be ketovore, carnivore? We don't know until we do the experiment. What we do know is that low carb clearly is where you need to be.
And that was an experiment for me originally. That was an
Yeah,
experiment. So it's like, oh, I don't know if I need to be there. I'll try it. And my whole mantra going into this, and that keto has taught me, is I can do anything for 30 days. It's
that's
fine.
right.
If you
That's
told
right.
me I can't walk through my front door for 30 days and I have to use the back door, that's fine.
That's right.
So, and the nice part about this sort of experimenting that you can do with your diet is that in 30 days you'll know, for the
You'll
most
know.
part.
Yeah, you'll
I
feel
mean,
it.
even though I didn't realize those full benefits for a few months, within the first 2 weeks, I knew. I mean, it made me feel better. And so, that part of it makes it very easy, I think, to not see this as this daunting task. It's just, look, if I can do 2 weeks, right? If I can do 30 days,
Okay.
I'll be able to at least get some indication as to whether or not this is working. And
Yeah,
that part of it is really powerful for me,
that's
because
right.
the truth is, um, the more you do it, the easier it becomes. And not
Oh,
just because
yeah,
of habits of mind, but because of
that's right.
physically, there are changes going on in my body that make me feel better and want to do that more.
That's
And so
right.
that's really something I find helpful.
And then once you do it, if you do something that you see that you find is optimizing you in a way that uh, is obvious, and you're like, I do feel better.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean you have to be Dr. Anthony Chafee and stay there. You can. There may be some things that are plants, like the fruit we love, which is avocados, right?
Hmm.
Some people, I'm carnivore, but when I eat avocados, it's great. So I think you don't have to be in this, you know, place where you just don't have any wiggle room. You decide, you kind of do an elimination diet, and then maybe add a few things that you do enjoy, because this is about enjoyment too. Then you learn, how do I make the best steak? I mean, Dr. Anthony Chafee makes a really good steak, right? That's what his beautiful girlfriend has shared with me when she was a guest.
Sure.
So, and how Maria Emmer can show you how to. She has a carnivore book. So, what other things can I do with this that'll make it more interesting? And then you add a few things depending on, and then you don't beat up on yourself constantly about, not being perfect. So, but I am curious a little bit more. My diet is fairly straightforward and simple, and I keep it as easy as possible. Um, so your routine when it comes to diet, is it so when you hear keto, it does create some wiggle room because there's so many keto products and things
Hmm.
like that. But when you think about your dietary pattern, what's keto to you? Do you do any of those things that are, considered dirty keto, when you want to have moments of indulgence? How do you manage that part?
It's a great question. So, in terms of keto, the way that I have it defined in my head, if I'm out of town or I don't have my kitchen available to me, right? And I love cooking. I grew up in a restaurant, so I grew up in a commercial kitchen. I mean, cooking was always something really important to me. And when I started keto, it became, there were challenges where it's like, oh, I enjoy that, but can I? I think everybody at the beginning kind of tries to see, well, can I make those almond flour muffins or whatever? And for me, I found quickly the answer is no. I have to I eat vegetables that grow above the ground, and that's where I try to get most of my carbs from. Um, a little bit from dairy, but then uh, high quality proteins that have high quality fats, and things like that. And so, you know, that I do stay away from a lot of the dirty keto stuff. I find that a zero tolerance policy for that stuff with myself is really the best way, because I am also someone who, um, the minute I kind of peel that Band-Aid back a little bit, I'm going to eat the whole thing of keto ice cream, or I'm going to eat the whole thing of keto, whatever the product. And also, I'm a big believer that there's not a whole lot of free lunches in nature. Your pancreas, your liver, whatever, it's going to know. So if there are hidden carbs in something, or if there are, especially because I don't make insulin myself, they're going to show up. So I just find keeping it simple is easiest. Again, as I said at the beginning, it was just more about I was still eating 3 meals a day, and then snacks in between, because that's what, as diabetics, you should have 3 meals and 3 snacks.
Mhm.
And I found that worked at the beginning. And then once I started fine tuning things and getting my BMI more to where I wanted it to be, I found that eating windows became a huge part of what helps my success. So currently I'll eat between 11 a.m. and 7 p.m. And not just for, the ketosis aspect of that, but also if I eat before 11 a.m., my dawn effect already is always a struggle. My blood sugar will start raising. If I eat, and even if I'm balancing it with insulin, I find that I'm taking so much more insulin than I would normally need just because of the time of day, that it's throwing off my numbers for the entire afternoon. And then especially when I'm taking all of that insulin, it might be bumping me out of dietary ketosis, not only for my metabolism, but also for my brain health. And so I just stay away from food before about 10:30, 11 o'clock in the morning. And I find it works really well. And then at the other end of the day, about 7 p.m., if I finish between 7 and 8, if I don't eat anymore after that, that gives my body time to process all the food that I ate, run through all of the insulin on board, which is what, on an insulin pump, I use an Omnipod, and it's basically the residual insulin that's running through you. That's part of a bolus, not your basal.
That's right.
I try to get that down to as close to zero as possible by bedtime. And I find that my overnights are so much easier to handle, because hypos at night are, most diabetics, I think, worry a huge amount about hypos at
Oh,
night.
big
Um,
time.
yeah. And before we had CGMs to wake you up, I don't even know how I slept. Like, I remember just, okay, I took an injection. I should be fine. I'm going to go to bed. Like, and so I try to keep that as low as possible, that insulin on board as low as possible before bedtime, so that I don't have to worry about it. I can go to sleep, and my blood sugar, my blood sugar looks like a flat sidewalk overnight. And are there spikes? Yeah, but 9 times out of 10, it's user error on my part, where I say, I can do that before bed, or well,
Right.
So
I
yeah,
love that.
yep.
I love the I like flat sidewalks. I always thought I wanted to live in a hilly place, but I guess I'll stay here in Illinois because we want
Yep.
things to be flat and level. And I let me say this real quick. You've used the term Don phenomena a couple of times, and for those who are not as familiar with that term, it's when your hormones in your body will naturally make in the early morning, a little cortisol and growth hormone. And when that happens, it'll increase your blood sugar because your body's not sure you're going to have breakfast. So it's going to make a little sugar for you. So that's the Don phenomenon. Then there's something called the Samoji effect, which is where you have a surge in hormones, and it's, due to maybe a low blood sugar overnight. And then you may have a little bit of that surge in your sugars. But those are terms you may hear. And that's why I like working with a teacher during this episode, so we can kind of throw some things out there. And if I don't know how your time is, but I thought maybe because of the richness of our conversation, I'd be interested in maybe making a part one and a part two, and we can literally, we can continue this conversation, wrap up this conversation for this episode, and let's make a part two, because I just want to make sure I touch on a few more points that I think are be very helpful. So is that going to work for your schedule?
Yeah, totally. As long as your wonderful audience will tolerate me. I hope I'm
Okay.
not talking everybody's ear off.
That's right. That's right. Well,
Like I said,
us.
I stuff is just so important to me, and it's one
That's
of those
right.
things where I feel like I went 24 years in the dark, and now all of a sudden this is here, and you go, oh my gosh, and other people need to know about this. So, and I'm sure if they're tuning into your show, it's as I do, it's something that I'm sure they're interested in. So,
Absolutely,
for
and
sure.
thank you for that. And again, guys, this is a great conversation. I really appreciate all the people who take the time to listen to a podcast and or check us out on YouTube. Because again, if it's not you, it's somebody you know. There's so many people who are suffering from type 2 diabetes, but particularly type 1s. Type 1s out there, and we need to provide cover for them as well. I do that for my wife, and hopefully this podcast is doing exactly that. So, and of course we got to check out part two, because I got to ask you how you're going to protect your nest in that episode. We won't do it now.
Yep.
So for those who checked us out and made it to the end of this video, thank you so much. I definitely encourage you to check out part two as we kind of dive a little deeper and ask more questions of Mike in terms of how he's achieving his journey. And as we conclude this episode of the Protecting Your Nest podcast, I really appreciate you. Thank you. Make sure to like and subscribe. And until the next episode, continue to be safe, be well, and continue to protect your nest.